Karen slapped my son at the playground. Didn't know he's the mayor's kid. It was a warm, cloudless afternoon when I decided to take my 6-year-old son Jamal to the neighborhood park. The sun had settled into that sweet golden hour glow, casting a soft light across the swings and slides, and the air buzzed with the carefree energy of children letting loose after a day of school. I sat on a nearby bench, sipping on an iced coffee and watching Jamal dart up the stairs of the jungle gym, his laughter blending in with the playful shouts all around. He had always loved the slide, specifically the twisty one at the top of the wooden tower. It was his favorite part of the park, and today he seemed especially excited to ride it again and again, turning each trip into a dramatic adventure mission, complete with sound effects and heroic poses. I didn't think much of it when I noticed a woman standing just a few feet from the playground entrance, arms crossed tightly over her chest and eyes fixed intently on the slide where Jamal played. She had that look, resting scowl, pursed lips, and a rigid posture that screamed, "I'm looking for a reason to yell at someone." Her designer sunglasses perched on her head, her platinum blonde bob perfectly sculpted, and her yoga pants stretched tight despite the absence of any actual yoga. Her child, a small girl who couldn't have been older than 5, stood beside her, clinging to a half-empty juice box and staring at the slide with a pout that looked more learned than natural. It was the first moment I noticed something off. The woman took a step forward, then another, and suddenly barked out, "How many times is he going to go down that slide?" Her voice pierced through the laughter and conversations in the park like a police siren, snapping everyone's attention toward her. Jamal, oblivious to the growing tension, just climbed the ladder again, lost in his own world. I stood up, slowly walking toward her, intending to defuse whatever she was about to ignite. "Ma'am," I started politely, "is there a problem?" She didn't even turn her head to acknowledge me. Instead, she kept her eyes on Jamal and said, "He's hogging the slide. My daughter been waiting patiently and your son has gone down at least 10 times. Maybe you should teach him to share." I blinked, surprised by the intensity in her tone. "He's 6, I said, keeping my voice calm. "He's just playing. There are plenty of kids taking turns and no one seems to have an issue with it." That's when she spun around to face me fully, as if my words were an invitation to unleash all the entitlement she had stored up over the years. "I don't care how old he is. He's being selfish. Look at him up there, acting like he owns the place. You parents think your kids are so special. Maybe it's time someone taught him a lesson in humility." Her words hit with a venom that I wasn't expecting. I opened my mouth to respond but didn't get the chance. She marched past me up to the play structure, and before I could stop her, she reached the base of the slide just as Jamal was about to come down again. Her hand shot out like lightning, and with an audible smack, she slapped him across the face. The sound echoed louder than I thought was possible in such an open space, and for a moment everything went still. I saw Jamal freeze, eyes wide with confusion, one hand clinging to the edge of the slide, the other rubbing his cheek. Then he burst into tears. I sprinted the few steps to reach him, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. "Jamal," I called, lifting him into my arms and checking his face. A red handprint was already forming on his soft brown skin, and the sight of it made my blood boil. I turned to the woman, who was now trying to walk away as if nothing had happened. "Hey," I shouted, catching the attention of several other parents. "You just hit my son." She turned with a look of exaggerated innocence. "He was being rude." I barely touched him. I saw a couple of parents pull out their phones. One of them, a teenage girl sitting near the sandbox, spoke up. "I recorded the whole thing," she said firmly. "She slapped him, no question." I didn't wait another second. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local police. My hands were shaking with rage and disbelief. This stranger, this entitled woman, had assaulted my child in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, and now she was pretending like she had the right. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, Karen, as I would later find out her name truly was, stood there with her arms crossed again, back in her original posture, but this time with a smug smirk on her face. "You're seriously calling the police?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Over a little slap, he was being a brat. You should thank me for disciplining him." I ignored her, gave the dispatcher our location, and described the incident in precise detail. The operator confirmed that a patrol car was on its way and advised me to stay at the scene. Meanwhile, other parents had gathered around, offering to be witnesses, shaking their heads in disgust and comforting Jamal, who was still clinging to me and sobbing into my shoulder. It felt like forever, but within 10 minutes, a black and white patrol car pulled up to the park entrance. 2 officers stepped out, one male and one female, and made their way toward the growing crowd. I waved them over immediately, pointing at Karen and explaining what happened. Karen, without missing a beat, launched into her own version of the story. "That boy was threatening my daughter," she claimed, raising her voice for dramatic effect. "He pushed past her and kept yelling at her. I had to step in." The male officer nodded but didn't look convinced. "Did you put your hands on him, ma'am?" he asked. "I barely touched him," she snapped back, her tone quickly shifting from performative victimhood to defensive indignation. The teenage girl with the video stepped forward. "I have it all here," she said, holding up her phone. "He didn't threaten anyone, she just slapped him because she was impatient." The officers reviewed the footage, and I watched as Karen's face slowly began to pale. The smirk was gone. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and she folded her arms again, this time tighter, like she was trying to brace for a storm. But she had no idea. This wasn't just about my son being assaulted. She didn't know who we were, didn't know that my wife, Jamal's mother, wasn't just a regular mom. She was the mayor of our city, and she was already on her way. Karen's smug confidence began to crumble the moment the officers replayed the video for a second time. The footage was damning, undeniable, and clear as daylight, her hand reaching up and striking my 6-year-old son's face as he smiled at the top of the slide, oblivious to the storm coming his way. The slap landed with a snap that could be heard even on the shaky phone video, and the gasps from the surrounding parents were a chilling chorus. One officer, the woman with a tight ponytail and sharp eyes, gave Karen a look that could have cut glass, while her partner quietly radioed for backup in a child welfare unit. It was happening quickly now, spiraling beyond anything Karen had likely expected when she stomped into the park with her entitlement tucked under her arm like a designer purse. But what she didn't yet realize, what made the corners of my mouth twitch into a restrained, grim smile, was that this story was far from over. She hadn't just slapped any child, she had slapped my child. And my wife, well, she wasn't the kind of woman to let something like this go quietly. As Karen stood there trying to spin her story to anyone who would still listen, I sent a quick message to my wife. She hit Jamal. "Police are here, come now." Within seconds, the typing dots appeared, then vanished. Her reply was just 3 words: "On my way." That was all I needed to feel anchored again. My wife was many things: kind, firm, deeply compassionate. But when it came to protecting children, especially her own, she was a force of nature wrapped in pearls and a tailored blazer. She didn't just hold office because she smiled well for photos. She earned her title through years of public service, hard decisions, and never backing down when it mattered. The city respected her, feared her sometimes, but above all, they knew better than to cross her. Karen, unfortunately, was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The officers separated us, taking statements while Jamal clung to me with a grip that broke my heart. I could still see the redness on his cheek, now a dull pink, but the emotional sting was still raw. He wasn't used to cruelty. We raised him in a home full of love, teaching him about kindness and fairness and how to treat others with respect. He didn't understand why someone's mother, an adult, would hurt him for playing like every other kid. That wound ran deeper than the slap itself, and I could feel his confusion and fear settle into me like a heavy fog. I kissed the top of his head and kept my arm tight around him, quietly thanking the officers for their swift response, while watching Karen's demeanor flicker from entitled superiority to anxious defensiveness. Karen's husband showed up not long after, striding into the park with the kind of aggression only found in men who believe the world owes them something. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore mirrored sunglasses despite the sun dipping lower on the horizon. He walked right up to the officers, already raising his voice. "What's going on here? My wife called and said some kid was harassing our daughter, and now the police are involved." This is ridiculous." One of the officers immediately stepped between him and Karen, hand lightly resting on her belt. "Sir, we're currently taking statements regarding a physical altercation involving your wife and a minor. Please lower your voice." He ignored the warning, pointing a finger at me. "Is this about your kid? What, he cries a little and suddenly you want to sue somebody?" His words were like gasoline to my already burning frustration, but I stayed silent. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I saw a familiar car pulling up near the edge of the park, and I knew the situation was about to shift again. My wife stepped out, heels clicking against the pavement, her face unreadable behind her dark sunglasses. She wasn't wearing her usual City Hall badge or even a campaign pin. She didn't need to. Her presence carried authority in the way she moved, the way her back was straight, the way the officers instinctively turned to greet her. Karen's husband frowned. "Who's this?" he asked, still clueless. One of the officers cleared his throat. "This is Mayor Thompson. She's the boy's mother." There was a beat of stunned silence that rippled across the small crowd. Karen's face turned the color of spoiled milk. Her husband's mouth dropped open, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping on dry land. My wife walked past them without a word, straight to Jamal and me. She knelt down, pulled our son gently into her arms, whispered something only he could hear, and then slowly rose to her full height, turning to face the woman who had dared to lay hands on her child. "You assaulted my son," she said, her voice cool and clear like the first crack of ice forming on a winter lake. "In public, in front of witnesses, and now you think you can justify it by claiming he was taking too long on a slide." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at her husband, then at the officers, as if begging someone to intervene. No one did. "We will be pressing charges," my wife continued, folding her arms. "You will also be hearing from our family's legal counsel regarding a civil suit for emotional distress and medical examination costs. And if you try to spin this into some Facebook sob story about victimhood, know that we already have statements, footage, and a police report to counter every lie." Karen finally found her voice. "It was just a slap," she began, but my wife shut it down immediately. "Don't finish that sentence," she said, cutting through the air with terrifying precision. "You don't get to downplay violence against a child, not mine, not anyone's." Then turning to the officers, she added, "Please ensure that a full report is filed tonight. And let me be perfectly clear, if there's even a hint of this being swept under the rug, I will personally ensure accountability from top to bottom." Karen's husband tried to speak again, but the fight had gone out of him. He muttered something under his breath and looked away. The officers nodded solemnly, taking extra care with their notes now. Karen had gone from shrieking menace to silent ghost in the span of 15 minutes, and now, as she sat on the park bench with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, she looked like she finally realized she wasn't the center of the world anymore. Not here. Not now. We stayed just long enough to complete the formalities. Jamal was calming down in my wife's arms, his tiny voice occasionally breaking through with questions like, "Why did she hit me?" and "Did I do something wrong?" Each time my wife answered with unwavering reassurance, "You did nothing wrong. You were just playing, and we're going to make sure you're safe." As we walked back to our car, the last light of the day spilling over the horizon, I glanced back at Karen one last time. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of shock, humiliation, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of regret. But it didn't matter anymore. The gears were already turning, and by the next day she would feel the full weight of what she'd done. The fallout began the moment we pulled into our driveway. My wife was already on her phone, speaking with her chief of staff and drafting a public statement to preempt the inevitable social media distortion Karen would attempt. She was experienced enough to know that when people like Karen felt cornered, they didn't reflect or apologize. They lashed out, twisted the narrative, and weaponized public opinion. Sure enough, within an hour of arriving home, a screenshot from a local community Facebook group made its way into my messages. Karen had wasted no time spinning her tale. In her post, she described a frightening encounter where her daughter was allegedly pushed and verbally threatened by an aggressive boy whose rude father escalated the situation. She claimed she barely grazed the child in an attempt to separate him from her daughter, and said she was now being unfairly attacked by politically motivated people looking to ruin her life. It was textbook deflection, full of false humility and gaslighting, and even more insulting was the photo she used, a heavily filtered selfie of herself and her daughter, accompanied by a caption that read, "Trying to stay strong for my little one in the face of bullying and lies." It was sickening. But what Karen failed to understand, what her smug little fingers typing on her keyboard didn't yet grasp, was that this wasn't her private echo chamber of fellow Karens who'd nod and validate her entitlement. This was a real city, and her actions had been witnessed, recorded, and confirmed. The mayor's son had been assaulted, and she was publicly denying it in an attempt to save face. The comment section on her post started out in her favor, sympathetic mothers parroting phrases like, "Kids these days are so disrespectful," and "You did what any mom would do." But it didn't last long. By the second hour, the tide began to turn. People who had been at the park started chiming in. One posted, "I was there. That little boy didn't do a thing wrong. She slapped him, hard, right in the face." Another uploaded the now viral video, captioned simply, "This is what actually happened." The comment section exploded. Her supporters vanished like roaches under a light. The footage spread across Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. Within 6 hours, local news outlets picked up the story. Child slapped at public park, mother identified as local daycare employee. And just like that, Karen's carefully crafted version of events was reduced to dust. Meanwhile, our phones wouldn't stop buzzing. Reporters were calling for statements. Parents from Jamal's school were sending supportive messages, and my wife's office had to release an official response to clarify that the family would be pursuing legal action, and that the mayor herself was recusing from any involvement in the legal process to avoid conflict of interest. She did, however, deliver a brief and powerful speech outside City Hall that evening. Cameras surrounded her, microphones extended like a sea of antennae, and in that quiet, firm voice of hers she stated, "What happened to my son is something no child should ever experience. This isn't about politics or public image. This is about accountability. My family will not be intimidated, and we will not be silent." The clip was broadcast citywide and quickly went national. Sympathy poured in, not because of the position she held, but because of how composed and direct she remained. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She stood like a wall against the storm, and people respected that. The next morning, the first legal domino fell. Karen was placed on immediate suspension from her daycare job pending an internal investigation. Parents whose children attended the center began demanding answers. Some pulled their kids out entirely. One woman recorded herself burning the daycare's flyer in her backyard, posting it with the caption, "I trusted these people with my baby. Never again." The daycare owner, likely panicking, issued a vague apology online, but made the critical error of trying to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding between parents. That only made things worse. Now the public was asking whether other incidents had been brushed aside. Karen had, after all, worked there for nearly 7 years. How many other slaps had gone unreported? How many kids had simply not told their parents? The questions piled up, and soon enough, a former employee anonymously posted a bombshell thread describing how Karen had always had a short fuse with children, often using intimidating language and occasionally grabbing kids by the arm or scolding them harshly in front of others. She claimed the owner was aware but never acted because Karen got things done and parents liked her no-nonsense attitude. The daycare tried to go radio silent after that, but it was too late. The story had gained traction far beyond our city. At home, Jamal was slowly recovering, though the emotional scar lingered. He asked questions at bedtime that no parent should ever have to answer. Why did she hate me? Am I in trouble for not getting off the slide? Will she come back to hurt me again? Each question felt like a dagger, but we answered with honesty and assurance. We told him he did nothing wrong, that she made a very bad choice, and that people who hurt others always face consequences. We made sure he knew he was safe, that the grown-ups were handling everything, and that he had done exactly what he was supposed to, just play and have fun. Still, it hurt to see the way his enthusiasm for the park dimmed. He no longer begged to go outside. His little action figures remained untouched in his toy box. He stayed close to us, more than usual, often curling up next to us on the couch without saying a word. It was around this time that my wife's lawyer called with an update. The civil suit was ready. The charges had been filed. The city prosecutor's office confirmed that Cairn was being formally charged with misdemeanor assault and that, due to the public nature of the case, they were moving swiftly to set a court date. The lawsuit also included claims for emotional distress, therapy costs, and punitive damages. Her legal team had even pulled together prior complaints against Cairn, two unrelated incidents from years back that had been quietly buried under the daycare's rug. This wasn't just an isolated outburst anymore. This was a pattern, one the court would be very interested in. Despite the whirlwind of activity, we kept our focus on Jamal. Every night we read to him from his favorite books. We cooked his favorite meals. We reminded him every single day that he was brave and strong and loved beyond measure. But underneath all that, a fire continued to burn in both me and my wife. We would not let this fade. Cairn had slapped a child, our child, and then had the audacity to lie about it, smear his name, and play the victim. Not only would she face justice, but she would face it under the full weight of truth and public scrutiny. And when it was over, she wouldn't just be a name on a daycare roster. She'd be a cautionary tale etched in digital memory, a reminder that you can't slap someone else's child and walk away without consequences, especially when that child belongs to the wrong parents to mess with. Court day arrived with the heavy finality of a storm long predicted. Outside the courthouse, cameras lined the walkway like vultures waiting to pick apart the bones of scandal. Reporters murmured among themselves while adjusting microphones and checking lighting. My wife and I arrived early with Jamal, though he wasn't going to testify today. We'd made the decision, with our lawyer's guidance, to protect him from the emotional stress of the proceedings unless absolutely necessary. He stayed with his aunt in a nearby waiting room, armed with snacks, headphones, and his favorite storybooks. Even with all the preparation, I could feel the tension vibrating in my chest, not just as a parent seeking justice for his son, but as a witness to something bigger, a public reckoning not only for Cairn, but for every adult who ever thought their entitlement excused cruelty. Cairn arrived later, flanked by her attorney and looking like a shadow of the woman we'd met in the park. Her previously perfect hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and the makeup she once wore like armor had been stripped away. She wore a dark, conservative suit that did nothing to hide the nervous twitch in her jaw. Her husband trailed behind her, equally pale and subdued, avoiding eye contact with the swarm of reporters shouting questions neither of them dared answer. There was no grandstanding now, no smug expressions or dismissive sneers. Now, there was only the slow, miserable realization of what she had invited into her life by refusing to control her temper. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was quieter but no less charged. A few journalists had been granted access to observe, and a handful of parents from the local school district sat in the back row, expressions tense with interest. The judge presiding over the case was known for being no-nonsense, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for giving little patience to theatrics. Once seated, the legal formalities began. The charges were read, motions were acknowledged, and the prosecution laid out its opening remarks with precision. They described the events clearly: the slap, the witnesses, the video footage, the immediate and appropriate police response. They emphasized that the case was not about public figures or politics, but about an adult physically assaulting a child in public and then attempting to manipulate the narrative afterward. Cairn's defense attorney, to no one's surprise, tried to paint a different picture. He leaned hard into the misunderstanding angle, claiming that Cairn had acted out of instinct when she thought her daughter was being threatened. He even floated the suggestion that Cairn had lightly tapped Jamal to get his attention and that the footage lacked full context. It was weak, and everyone in the room could feel it. There was no escaping the fact that the video didn't show Jamal acting aggressively or even speaking to Karen's daughter. It showed a child playing happily, unaware of the approaching adult, followed by the unmistakable sound of a slap and the immediate distress that followed. The footage spoke for itself. As the trial progressed, a series of witnesses testified, starting with the teenage girl who had recorded the video. She was articulate and composed, explaining what she saw and confirming that Karen's version of events was simply not true. She'd been sitting with friends and noticed the commotion, had seen Karen shouting, and then, horrified, had caught the slap on video. Her testimony was followed by a parent who'd been on the swings at the time. She confirmed that Jamal hadn't done anything inappropriate or threatening, that he had in fact been taking turns and behaving like any other well-mannered child. Witness after witness came forward, each one reinforcing the same image. Karen had not been provoked. She had been impatient, entitled, angry that a child wasn't moving at her pace. Then came the moment that truly sealed the courtroom's mood. The prosecution played the video for the court. It was projected on a screen, the audio turned up loud enough that everyone could hear the cheerful sounds of the park morph into the shrill tone of Karen's voice, followed by the sharp, heart-sickening smack and Jamal's immediate cry. Even Karen couldn't keep her eyes on the screen. She looked down, face flushed, jaw clenched. Her husband shifted in his seat, no longer looking at her at all. Our lawyer made his case next in the civil suit, presenting the emotional trauma Jamal had suffered, the therapy appointments we'd already begun, and a written statement from a child psychologist who had evaluated him and noted signs of stress, avoidance, and fear. He also included a powerful letter we'd written, as parents, detailing what it had been like to explain to our 6-year-old that someone had hurt him and then lied about it. We spoke not just as public figures, but as a mother and father who'd been forced to watch their son navigate fear and confusion, because a stranger decided her frustration was more important than his safety. Karen never took the stand. Her attorney advised against it, likely knowing that cross-examination would expose the cracks too easily. Instead, she sat silently, her shoulders tight and her hands clasped together in her lap, visibly trembling each time the word assault was used. When the final arguments were made and the judge recessed for deliberation, there was a silence in the courtroom that felt as thick as fog. Even though we had every reason to believe justice was on our side, we also knew how unpredictable the system could be. We sat there, hands entwined, waiting. When the judge returned, the entire room straightened. She wasted no time. In calm, decisive language, she found Karen guilty of misdemeanor assault and held her accountable in the civil suit for punitive and emotional damages. She was ordered to pay a significant fine, as well as cover all medical and psychological expenses for Jamal's care. A restraining order was issued, forbidding her from approaching within 200 feet of Jamal or any member of our family for the next 5 years. The courtroom did erupt. There was no cheering or clapping, just a release of tension like a held breath finally exhaled. Karen looked stunned, her mouth slightly open as if the reality of consequence had only just become real to her. She stood to leave, escorted quietly by her lawyer, and as she passed by us, she didn't make eye contact. Not with me, not with my wife, not with anyone. Outside, the press swarmed again, but we didn't speak. We walked past them, straight to Jamal, who ran to us with a grin that, for the first time in days, looked like the old Jamal. He didn't know all the legal terms or the weight of the decisions made inside that courtroom. All he knew was that his parents stood up for him, that someone who hurt him had been told she was wrong, and that he could feel safe again. That was more than enough. The days following the verdict brought a quiet kind of peace that we hadn't realized we were missing until it returned. For the first time in weeks, our home didn't feel weighed down by anxiety or outrage. Jamal's laughter rang freely through the hallways again, echoing off the walls like music. He began returning to his usual rhythms, slowly but surely reclaiming the pieces of his childhood that had been shaken loose by that one jarring moment in the park. The nightmares stopped, the questions about guilt faded, and his curiosity blossomed once more. It didn't happen all at once, but each day we saw more of our little boy re-emerging, unburdened, healing not just because of time, but because he saw the world hold someone accountable for hurting him. That mattered more than anything. We didn't celebrate the verdict in the traditional sense. There were no parties, no victory speeches, no public declarations of triumph. Instead, we honored the resolution in the most personal, meaningful way possible. We went back to the park. It was a deliberate choice, one that Jamal initially hesitated over. He clung to my hand as we walked toward the playground, his grip tight and his eyes scanning every face around him. But my wife knelt beside him before we crossed the woodchip border and told him gently, "This is your place, baby. No one can take it from you. Not ever again." And with that, he nodded, took a shaky breath, and walked toward the slide. What followed was nothing short of beautiful. Kids who had been there that day ran to greet him, treating him like a hero returning from battle. Parents offered waves, nods, and even a few kind words under their breath. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner. Others expressed gratitude that our family had done what needed to be done. There was no judgment in their eyes anymore, only a shared understanding that something wrong had been made right. Jamal climbed to the top of the slide, paused, then shouted down, "Watch this, Daddy," before twisting down with a squeal of joy. My heart swelled. That single moment, watching him reclaim the place where he'd been hurt, felt more victorious than any courtroom declaration ever could. As for Cairn, her silence was the loudest part of the aftermath. In the days following the ruling, she disappeared from social media entirely. Her job at the daycare, unsurprisingly, was terminated permanently, and while no official statement was released from the center, word spread that she would not be permitted near children in any professional capacity again. Her reputation, once guarded by image and illusion, was dismantled completely. A few local gossip blogs tried to stir sympathy for her, publishing half-hearted opinion pieces about cancel culture and mistakes made in moments of stress, but they were met with overwhelming backlash. No one was interested in rewriting history. The footage existed. The witnesses existed. The story had been told, and no amount of spin could erase the truth. She had slapped a 6-year-old and tried to lie about it until the weight of reality crushed her narrative to pieces. We didn't bother responding to those who tried to defend her. We had no need to. The court had spoken. The city had watched. The damage she did to herself had already far exceeded anything we could have inflicted. What mattered now was that our son felt safe again, that our family could move forward, and that people like her knew they couldn't behave that way without consequence. The final step came a week later when our attorney received confirmation that Cairn had agreed to a settlement on the civil suit portion of the case. She would be paying damages over time, structured in monthly payments, small amounts by some standards, but meaningful in what they represented. Every check that arrived would be a reminder, not just to her, but to anyone watching, that our child's dignity and well-being were worth defending to the fullest extent of the law. With the public attention slowly fading, life began returning to normal. My wife resumed her mayoral duties, facing a whirlwind of interviews and appearances with the same calm strength she had shown throughout the ordeal. But there was a subtle change in her public presence. She had always been respected, but now there was a deeper reverence, a recognition that she wasn't just a capable leader but a fiercely protective mother who walked the talk. People didn't just see her as a politician anymore. They saw her as someone who stood up when it mattered most. And though she never once exploited the incident for political gain, it was clear that the transparency, grace, and firmness with which she handled it left a lasting impression. Jamal, for his part, found his own way to process the experience. At school, his teacher told us he'd been drawing pictures of superheroes again, only this time they looked different. One wore a blazer and glasses and had curly hair pulled into a bun. Another held a gavel and stood in front of a giant courtroom. One drawing made me pause. It was a picture of Jamal himself, standing on the top of a slide, holding a shield. Above his head, in messy, brightly colored letters, it said, "Nobody can push me down." I showed it to my wife that evening, and though she said nothing at first, I saw the way her eyes softened, the way she blinked more than usual. That small, innocent piece of art said everything. In the final days of the ordeal, I posted a short message on Reddit, not seeking revenge or attention, but simply to share the outcome with the quiet community that had once given me a space to vent when I needed it most. The post was titled simply, "Karen slapped my son at the playground, didn't know he's the mayor's kid. She knows now." I detailed how justice had played out, not with rage or spectacle, but with truth, patience, and strength. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of upvotes, messages of support from strangers around the world, and a sea of comments saying the same thing. Thank you for not letting it go. Thank you for standing up. And while I appreciated every word, I knew the real thanks didn't belong to me. It belonged to a brave 6-year-old who endured something terrible and found his way back to joy. To a mother who turned her grief into fire and protected her son with unshakable resolve. To a community that refused to stay silent. And maybe, just maybe, to a world that was reminded that there are still lines that must never be crossed. In the end, Karen learned the hard way that her actions had consequences. And our son. He learned something too, that no matter how scary the world can be, he would never have to face it alone.